There is a lawn behind Buckingham Palace that most people in the world will never walk across. From the outside, through the tall iron gates, tourists press their phones between the bars and photograph the guards, the golden fountain, the endless stone face of the building. They imagine, perhaps, that behind those walls there is only marble and silence and men in red coats standing very still. What they cannot see is the garden, 40 acres of it, a lake with its own island, a rose walk, a summer house. And on a handful of warm afternoons each summer, that hidden garden fills with the sound of 8,000 ordinary people talking all at once, teacups in their hands, hats tipped against the sun, waiting for a moment many of them will remember for the rest of their lives. This is the story of those afternoons. Not the state banquets, not the crowns and the carriages, but something quieter and, in a way, far stranger. It is the story of how a king and queen spend their summer serving tea to nurses, to lifeboat volunteers, to school caretakers and hospice workers and men who have quietly given 40 years to their villages without ever asking for thanks. It is a tradition older than the motor car, older than the light bulb, and it has survived 2 world wars, 6 monarchs, and a century and a half of change without ever losing its strange, gentle magic. And in the summer of 2026, it played out one more time, from the first cup poured in May to the final note of the anthem in Edinburgh at the end of June. To understand what those afternoons meant, you have to go back to where they began. The year was 1868. Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 31 years, and she was, by then, a woman deep in mourning. Her beloved husband, Prince Albert, had died 7 years earlier, and the Queen had all but vanished from public life, hiding in her palaces, dressed in black, refusing the crowds who longed to see her. The country was beginning to grumble. A monarch who never appeared, some said, was hardly a monarch at all. And so, slowly, carefully, the Queen began to find small ways to open her doors again. One of those ways was an afternoon gathering in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. The very first of these garden parties is recorded as taking place on 22 June 1868. In her private journal that evening, the Queen wrote a single, contented line about the weather. She noted that the afternoon had been splendid, and not too hot. Royal news, royal news. That small remark tells you something important. From the very beginning, these were not grand political events. They were, at heart, simply pleasant afternoons in a beautiful garden, and the weather mattered as much as anything else. Victoria called her early gatherings breakfasts, though they were held in the afternoon, and involved no breakfast at all, a piece of royal eccentricity that has always made people smile. What they really were, in truth, was afternoon tea by another name, dressed up in the finest clothes the country could offer. But the parties were also quietly doing an important job, and over the decades that job would change completely. For a long time, the royal social calendar had been ruled by something called the presentation party. At these events, young women from wealthy and aristocratic families, the débutantes, were formally presented to the monarch, curtsying deeply as they were introduced into high society. It was a ritual of class and privilege, a way of announcing that a certain sort of girl from a certain sort of family was now ready to be seen and married. The garden parties slowly and then completely replaced this older world. Historically, the garden parties took the place of presentation parties once attended by débutantes, and over time they evolved into a way of recognizing and rewarding public service. Royal family. That single change is the whole heart of the story. The gates of the palace garden, once opened only to the daughters of dukes and earls, were slowly opened instead to the daughters of the nation itself. The nurse, the teacher, the volunteer, the soldier. By the middle of the 20th century, the change was formal and permanent. In the 1950s, the number of garden parties held each summer at Buckingham Palace was increased from 2 to 3, and the extra parties took the place of the old presentation parties. The garden had become, in the truest sense, a garden for everyone, or at least for everyone who had earned their place through service rather than birth. Yeoman off the guard. And that word, earned, matters enormously, because you cannot simply buy your way into this garden. There is no ticket for sale. There is no line to join. In fact, one of the most surprising things about a royal garden party is that you are not allowed to ask to attend at all. It is not possible to acquire an invitation through direct application to Buckingham Palace. Instead, the whole thing works through a vast, quiet, invisible web of people across the country who are trusted to notice good work when they see it. A long-established network of sponsors is used to invite guests, including Lord Lieutenants, societies and associations, government departments, local government, the armed services, the church and other faiths. Royal family, royal family. Picture how that actually works in a real life. Somewhere in England, a woman has spent 30 years running a food bank out of a church hall. She has never been paid. She has never been thanked in any public way. But the people around her have noticed, and one day her name is quietly passed upward, from a local charity to a county official, from that official to the Lord Lieutenant, the king's own representative in that part of the country. And then, weeks later, a stiff cream-colored envelope lands on her doormat, and inside it is an invitation to Buckingham Palace, and she stands in her kitchen and reads it 3 or 4 times because she cannot quite believe that it is real. That moment, repeated tens of thousands of times across the country every single year, is what the garden party truly is. Over the course of each year, more than 30,000 guests are invited to spend a relaxed summer afternoon in the gardens of Buckingham Palace or the Palace of Holyrood House. Royal family. The scale of it, once you look closely, is almost hard to imagine. These are not small tea parties. Each single afternoon brings around 8,000 people into the garden at once. Feeding a crowd that size and doing it with elegance is a feat of planning that would defeat most armies. The numbers are the stuff of legend. At a typical garden party, guests get through around 27,000 cups of tea, 20,000 sandwiches, and 20,000 slices of cake. All of it is served from a buffet table that stretches an astonishing 408 feet in length, with some 400 members of staff working to serve the guests. Somewhere in the palace kitchens, in the days before each party, there is a quiet frenzy of cutting, buttering, baking, and stacking that few guests ever think about as they nibble a delicate sandwich in the sunshine. Yeoman off the guard, yeoman off the guard. The day itself follows a rhythm that has barely changed in generations, and knowing that rhythm makes the whole thing come alive. The gates swing open in the early afternoon, and the guests begin to arrive, walking a route that few people ever get to take. They cross the forecourt in front of the palace, pass through the building, come out through the great inner courtyard, and finally step out onto the terrace and down into the garden itself. For most, it is the only time in their lives they will ever set foot inside those walls, and many of them stop on the terrace steps, just for a second, to take in the sheer size and beauty of the private world spread out below them. The royal forums. Then there is the dress. This is a place of hats and morning coats and very best shoes. The rules are gentle but firm, and they are part of the charm. Gentlemen wear morning dress or lounge suits, while women wear day dress, usually finished with a hat or a fascinator, and national dress and uniform are also often worn. Across the lawn you will see the turban beside the top hat, the sari beside the tweed, the military medal beside the summer frock, a portrait in a single garden of the whole strange, mixed, magnificent country. And for many guests, especially the women, the hat becomes a small adventure of its own, borrowed from a friend or bought specially for the day, a little crown of their own for an afternoon among royalty. Royal family. While the guests gather, the garden is watched over by some of the most striking figures in British ceremony. These are the yeomen of the guard, and they are the source of one of the most common mistakes visitors make. In their scarlet and gold uniforms they look, at a glance, almost exactly like the famous beefeaters of the Tower of London, but they are not the same. The beefeaters are wardens of the tower, while the yeomen of the guard are the sovereign's own bodyguard, and the two are entirely different bodies despite their similar dress. When the moment comes for the royal family to appear, the yeomen form a human corridor, standing tall and still, carrying their long ceremonial weapons, creating a lane through the crowd for the king and queen to walk. On the terrace steps they lower their tall weapons slightly as they descend, so as not to catch the canopy stretched overhead, a small, careful detail in a grand piece of theater. The Royal Forum's Joswini. And then, at 4 o'clock exactly, everything stops. Two military bands have been playing lightly through the afternoon, taking turns, filling the garden with everything from old standards to film themes and popular songs. But now the music changes. The party officially begins the instant the members of the royal family step into the garden at 4 o'clock, and one of the two bands strikes up the national anthem. 8,000 people fall silent and turn as one toward the terrace. And there, at the top of the steps, the royal hosts appear, and a small shiver runs through the whole crowd, because for many of them this is the closest they will ever come to the living heart of 1,000 years of history. Royal family. What happens next is the part that surprises people most. You might imagine that the king and queen simply wave from a distance, or stand on a stage while the crowd looks on. But that is not how it works at all. Instead, the royal family walks down into the crowd and they walk through it slowly on foot, close enough to touch. While the bands play on, the members of the royal family circulate among the guests through what are called lanes, each royal taking a different route, with presentations made along the way so that everyone has a fair chance of meeting one of them. That fairness is deliberate and rather beautiful. The routes are spread out, the meetings are half by chance, and so the retired postman has just as real a hope of shaking the king's hand as anyone else in the garden. Royal family. Slowly, over the better part of 2 hours, the royals make their way across the lawn, pausing, listening, asking questions, learning the small stories of the people who have been brought here to be honored. And at the far end of their journey there waits a very particular tent. Along one side of the garden stands the longest marquee most guests have ever seen, and near it, smaller and grander, stands the royal tea tent. At Buckingham Palace, the yeomen of the guard, the gentlemen at arms and the gentlemen ushers are all on duty, guiding and guarding the great occasion. Members of the royal family finally arrive at the royal tea tent, where they meet still more guests, while everyone else is free to eat, drink, and stroll around the gardens. The whole afternoon is a strange and lovely mix of the very grand and the very ordinary, a queen in one tent, a plate of fruit tart in the other, and a lake between them where ducks paddle as though no king had ever lived. BMSF Royal Family. And then, as the light softens toward evening, it ends the way it began, with music. At around 6 o'clock the king and the rest of the royal family leave the garden, and the national anthem is played once more to mark the close of the party. The crowd begins to drift back toward the gates, clutching programs and memories, and the great tents stand empty behind them, and the staff begin the enormous quiet work of clearing away the remains of 20,000 slices of cake. By nightfall the garden is silent again, hidden again, waiting for the next warm afternoon. That is the machine, the tradition, the century-and-a-half-old ritual. But a tradition is only ever half the story. The other half is the people who step into it each particular year, and the small human moments that make one summer different from all the summers before. And the summer of 2026 had more than its share of those. Yeoman off the guard, the first cup of the 2026 season was poured on a bright Wednesday in early May, and the date itself carried a quiet meaning that not everyone in the crowd would have noticed. King Charles opened the garden party season at Buckingham Palace on Wednesday, the 6th of May, a day chosen to mark the 3rd anniversary of his coronation. 3 years earlier, almost to the day, he had knelt in Westminster Abbey and been crowned before the world. Now on that same date there was no crown, no golden coach, no oath, only a garden, a crowd of citizens, and a pot of tea. There is something telling in that choice. A man could mark the anniversary of his crowning in any number of grand ways. Charles chose to mark it by spending an afternoon among the very people the crown is supposed to serve. Marie Claire. He was not alone. The king was joined at that first party by Queen Camilla and by Princess Anne, and together they moved out among the guests. The garden that day held the usual cross-section of the country, the quiet heroes of 1,000 towns and villages, each with a story of service behind their invitation. Royal garden parties honor members of the British public who have served their communities, and this was the first such party of the year. But among the thousands of guests that afternoon, it was not a person who stole the show. It was a dog, Marie Claire. His name was Vegas, and he was a brown cocker spaniel with the particular gentle patience of a working animal. He was not there as a pet or a mascot. Vegas was a service dog from the charity Hearing Dogs for Deaf People, present with his owner, Kate Wilson. As the king made his slow way down one of the lanes, greeting guest after guest, he came upon the little spaniel and stopped. Anyone who knows anything about Charles knows his deep, lifelong love of animals, and it showed. The king bent down to pet the cocker spaniel and fell into conversation with the dog's owner, clearly charmed. When it was explained to him what the dog actually did, that these animals are trained not to guide the blind, as many assume, but to alert the deaf to the sounds they cannot hear, the king reacted with genuine, delighted surprise. "They do hearing dogs too now. Marvelous," he said. "Marie Claire +2. It is a tiny moment. A few words, a pat on the head, a spaniel in a garden. But it is exactly the sort of moment these afternoons exist to create, and it is worth pausing on because it reveals something real. Here was a man of 77, a king, the head of state of a large nation, genuinely learning something new from an ordinary woman and her dog, and taking open, childlike pleasure in it. Vegas himself seemed entirely unimpressed by the royal presence. The spaniel jumped up enthusiastically against the king's legs, and Charles seemed so taken with him that one waiting guest, further down the line, called out that they were still waiting their turn over there. One imagines the ripple of laughter through the crowd, the King of the United Kingdom, gently scolded by a stranger for spending too long with a dog. Marie Claire. Kate Wilson, Vegas's owner, later spoke about what the animal meant to her, and her words gave the small scene its weight. A teacher, she explained that having Vegas had changed everything, that he could alert her to sounds and alarms going off, and that it meant her son could leave her alone without worrying. That is what the garden party does at its best. It takes a woman whose quiet, difficult life has been transformed by a trained dog, and it puts her in a royal garden on a sunny afternoon, and lets a king kneel down in front of her and marvel at her companion. For an hour, the ordinary is treated as remarkable because it is. Marie Claire. Vegas met more than just the king. Queen Camilla greeted the spaniel too, as did Princess Anne, who serves as patron of the Hearing Dogs charity. Anne, ever direct and warm with animals in her own no-nonsense way, is said to have asked whether the dog took such a liking to everyone or whether it was just her. The kind of dry, human remark that made the moment feel less like ceremony and more like a family afternoon that happened to be attended by thousands. And that really is the trick these parties pull off again and again. They are enormous, formal, historic events. They are also somehow personal. Marie Claire. The season did not stop there. Less than a week later, on a Tuesday in the middle of May, the palace gates opened again for another 8,000 guests. On the 12th of May 2026, King Charles and Queen Camilla hosted the third garden party of the season at Buckingham Palace. On this occasion, they were supported by another branch of the wider royal family. The king and queen were joined by the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester. The Gloucesters are among the quieter, harder-working members of the family, rarely in the headlines, steadily carrying out the sort of duties that keep the whole institution running. Their presence was a reminder that the garden parties are not a one-person show. They are a shared effort, spread across many shoulders, so that thousands of guests across several afternoons each get their moment. Numeroyals. By this point in the season, the sheer relentlessness of the royal summer schedule was becoming clear. Each year, more than 30,000 guests are invited to these parties in recognition of public service, nominated by organizations including the armed forces, the health service, and a wide range of charities. To honor all of them means party after party, handshake after handshake, story after story, week after week, in whatever weather an English summer chooses to send. It is easy to picture the glamour of a garden party and forget the stamina it demands of the hosts, the hours on your feet, the endless small conversations, the constant need to be warm and present and interested with person after person after person, none of whom you have ever met and most of whom you will never see again. Numi royals. And it was against that backdrop of relentless duty that one of the small, telling moments of the season quietly occurred. Not every royal event includes every member of the family, and in the middle of May, there came an afternoon where the pattern shifted. There was a special garden party held that season to mark a major milestone for one of the king's most personal causes. Charles arrived at a Buckingham Palace garden party celebrating the 50th anniversary of the King's Trust, dressed in a sharp gray morning suit. The King's Trust, long known as the Prince's Trust, before Charles became king, is arguably the achievement he is proudest of in his whole life, a charity he founded as a young man to help struggling young people find work, training, and hope. To reach its 50th year was, for him, deeply personal. The Royal Observer. And on that particular afternoon, he arrived without the Queen at his side. The King made his arrival at the garden party without Queen Camilla present. To the fabricators of online drama, a detail like that is raw meat, the sort of thing that gets twisted into invented tales of rifts and replacements and secret feuds. But the truth is almost always far simpler and far more human. The royal diary is enormous, and the Queen carries her own full load of engagements, her own charities, her own causes. She cannot be in two places at once, and she is not required to shadow her husband to every single event. That Charles attended the 50th anniversary of his own life's work in person, morning suit crisp, cause close to his heart, is the real story of that day. There is no palace intrigue in a husband and wife simply having different appointments in the same busy week. The Royal Observer. It is worth sitting with that point for a moment, because it goes to the heart of why a truthful telling of these events matters. The garden parties are, on the surface, gentle and uneventful: tea, hats, handshakes, a band. That very gentleness is what makes them a target for invention. It is easy and tempting to take a real photograph of a king arriving alone and spin around it a story of drama and division that never happened. But the dignity of these occasions and of the people in them lies precisely in their ordinariness. A queen at one event and not another is not a scandal. It is a marriage of two busy people, each doing their duty, sometimes together and sometimes apart, across a summer packed with obligation. What the London parties of 2026 showed, taken together, was a family sharing the weight of an ancient duty. The king anchoring the season, opening it on the anniversary of his crowning. The Queen at his side through most of it. Princess Anne bringing her patronages and her dry warmth. The Gloucesters stepping in to host their share. A spaniel named Vegas reminding everyone that the point of the whole thing is connection, not grandeur. And behind every handshake, a nominated guest, a nurse, a volunteer, a carer being told, in the most memorable way a country can manage, that their quiet years of service had been seen. By the end of May, the London season had run its course. The great tents on the Buckingham Palace lawn came down. The garden fell quiet once more, but the year's parties were not yet finished. There remained one more, held not in London at all, but 200 miles to the north, in a palace beneath a great extinct volcano, wrapped in a week of Scottish ceremony that is older and stranger than almost anything in the London calendar. And it was there, at the end of June, that the garden party season of 2026 would reach its grandest and most moving finale. To understand the final party of the season, you first have to understand where it happened, because Scotland does not simply borrow London's traditions. It has its own, and they are magnificent. Every summer the monarch travels north to spend a week living in Edinburgh, at the ancient palace of Holyrood House, the official royal residence in Scotland. This week has a name of its own. It is known as Royal Week or Holyrood Week, and it runs from the end of June into the beginning of July each year, with the monarch traditionally spending the time visiting places across Scotland while based at the Palace of Holyrood House. The purpose of the whole week is celebration of Scottish culture, of Scottish achievement, of Scottish community. Hello. And the week does not simply begin. It is opened with a ceremony so old and so peculiar that it feels like something out of legend. Royal Week always commences at Holyrood with the ceremony of the Keys, in which the king is formally welcomed into the city of Edinburgh by the Lord Provost, who offers him the keys to the city. In this ritual, the king is symbolically handed the keys and then returns them to the city's keeping, a graceful exchange that says, in effect, that the monarch comes not as a conqueror but as a guest, trusting the city to keep its own keys. It is pure theater, centuries deep, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. Hello. In 2026, that week built toward its great public moment on the last day of June. On Tuesday, the 30th of June 2026, King Charles and Queen Camilla, alongside Princess Anne and the Duke of Edinburgh, welcomed more than 8,000 guests from across Scotland to the annual garden party at the Palace of Holyrood House. Note who stood together on that Scottish lawn, the King and the Queen, side by side once more, and with them two of the hardest-working figures in the family. This was no solo appearance and no quiet affair. It was the full force of the monarchy, gathered in Edinburgh, to honor the people of Scotland in the same way the people of England had been honored in May. Royals. The day was carefully built. Before the garden filled with guests, there was solemn business to attend to. Charles presided over an investiture ceremony at the Palace of Holyrood House, before he and Camilla went on to host the garden party alongside the Duke of Edinburgh and the Princess Royal. An investiture is the ceremony where honors are formally bestowed, where the ordinary citizen kneels or bows and rises again with a medal and a title, recognized at last by their country. So the shape of that Tuesday was a kind of poem in itself. First the formal honoring of individuals inside the palace, then the great open-air honoring of thousands out in the garden. Private dignity, then public celebration, all in a single Scottish afternoon. Hello. There was ceremony wrapped around the garden party too, of a distinctly military and Scottish flavor. Charles's first engagement of the day took place in the gardens of Holyrood House, where he received a royal salute and inspected a guard of honor provided by Balaclava Company. The name Balaclava carries a heavy weight of history, echoing back to one of the most famous and terrible actions in British military memory, and to see a guard bearing that name render honors to the king is to feel the long thread of Scottish service to the crown pulled taut across the centuries. This is what makes the Holyrood party feel different from its London cousins. In Edinburgh, the whole thing is woven through with the particular ceremony, music and pride of Scotland. Hello. The guest list as ever was the true heart of it. More than 8,000 people, drawn from every corner of Scotland, each one there because someone had noticed their service and passed their name upward. The same quiet machinery that fills the Buckingham Palace lawn fills the Holyrood garden, the nominations, the sponsors, the cream envelopes landing on doormats in Aberdeen and Glasgow and the Far Islands. And on the day, that Scottish crowd stood in its finest clothes and best hats, beneath the great green hill of Arthur's Seat that rises behind the palace, and watched the royal family come out among them exactly as they do in London, on foot, through the lanes, close enough to speak to. Among the family that day, one figure deserves a story of her own, because no account of the royal garden parties is complete without her. Princess Anne, the king's younger sister, is widely regarded as the hardest-working member of the entire royal family, a woman who year after year carries out more official engagements than almost anyone else in the household, with little fuss and less complaint. And she has a particular, personal connection to these garden afternoons that runs deeper than mere attendance. There is one garden party every year that belongs, in a sense, especially to her. Traditionally, a garden party is held each year for the Not Forgotten Association, a charity for war veterans, and it is usually hosted by the charity's patron, the Princess Royal family. The Not Forgotten Association exists to support and cheer wounded and isolated veterans and serving personnel, some of them very old, some of them badly injured, many of them lonely. That a garden party is set aside each year specifically for them, and hosted by Anne herself, tells you something about what these events are truly for. They are not simply pretty gatherings. They are, at their best, a nation's way of saying to its most overlooked servants, "You are not forgotten." The very name of the charity is the whole philosophy of the garden parties in 3 words. And Anne, standing on the Holyrood lawn in June 2026 alongside her brother the King, embodied that philosophy more fully than perhaps anyone. There is a reason so many guests describe these afternoons, years later, with tears in their eyes. For most of the 8,000, this is the single time in their lives that their country will stop and look directly at them and thank them by name. A woman who spent 40 years quietly nursing strangers. A man who has run a village charity since before his children were born. A veteran who came home from a war no one talks about anymore. They arrive not as celebrities or aristocrats, but as ordinary people who did something good and kept doing it. And for one afternoon, they walk in a royal garden and drink the king's tea and stand a handshake away from 1,000 years of history. That is the gift the garden party gives, and it has given it, in more or less the same form, since Queen Victoria first opened her gates in her grief in 1868. The Holyrood party of 2026 ended as all these parties end, gently, with the light going golden over the Edinburgh rooftops and the bands playing the crowd back toward the gates. The tents came down. The guard stood down. The keys of the city stayed, as they always do, with the city. And with that final Scottish afternoon, the garden party season of 2026 was complete. A season that had opened in London on the anniversary of a coronation, wound through the warm weeks of May, and closed at last beneath a Scottish hill at the end of June. It is worth stepping back at the end to see the whole shape of it. Across a single summer, the King and Queen and their family had welcomed tens of thousands of ordinary people into their most private gardens, in 2 countries, across half a dozen afternoons. They had done it not for cameras or crowds of tourists, but for nurses and volunteers and veterans and carers. They had bent down to pet a hearing dog, listened to the stories of strangers, honored a charity called the Not Forgotten, and carried a tradition a century and a half old one more year forward without letting it grow cold or stale. In an age that often feels loud and angry and divided, there is something quietly radical about the idea of a monarch spending the summer simply serving tea to good people, and telling them, in the grandest way a country knows how, that their goodness has been seen. The gates of Buckingham Palace are closed again now, and the garden behind them is hidden once more from the phones pressed between the iron bars. But somewhere out in the country, in kitchens and hallways in towns whose names will never make the news, there are people who spent an afternoon in that hidden garden in the summer of 2026, and who will carry the memory of it for the rest of their lives. And next summer, when the weather turns warm again, the great tents will rise on the lawn one more time. The yeomen will lower their weapons on the terrace steps. The band will strike up the anthem at 4 o'clock exactly, and the oldest gentle tradition in the royal calendar will open its gates once more, and quietly, cup by cup, remind a whole nation that ordinary service is the most extraordinary thing of all.